Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. Ukraine War news update, second part thereof for the 23rd of May 2024. Just before we start on the military aid segment, there's been some brutal attacks on Kharkiv this morning. Russia has sent in a whole bunch of missiles, I think presumably S-300, S-400 surface-to-air missiles into Kharkiv, and they've caused all sorts of damage. A number of people have died. Zelensky has responded to this, published the consequences of the strikes on Kharkiv, extremely brutal Russian attack against Kharkiv and Lubotin. According to preliminary data, 15 rockets at once. Unfortunately, there are people killed and injured. So that is not a good scene there. Kharkiv being brutally terrorized by the Russians, as I mentioned earlier. That is terrorism. That's not a military target, and I really hope the mainstream media pick up on this and say, look, this is absolutely unacceptable. And that feeds into these sorts of discussions that we're going to go on to talk about now, which is that should the US allow weapons to be fired into Russia to hit genuine military targets that are actually would be part of a defensive set of actions, because you can't defend yourself against Russian airframes dropping bombs on Ukraine by just hitting the bombs when they cross the border. You can't take out those those car bombs. They're too difficult to shoot down. So you cannot defend against them. You can't really defend against S-300 missiles being sent into Ukraine across the border. They have a ballistic trajectory. You can't take them down. How do you defend against them? You take out the missile systems, the S-300 systems, or the airframes carrying those bombs at source or in flight. And to do that, you need to shoot into Russian airspace or onto Russian territory. It has to happen. So that something has to go, I think. Something has to change here. It's not possible to defend Ukrainian territory without defeating the glide bomb threat, says George Barros of the Institute for the Study of War. Defeating the glide bomb threat requires intercepting Russian aircraft in Russian airspace. As I've just said, the glide bombs are launched from Russian airspace and glide into Ukraine. This is Ostap Yarish, who is I think he's the Ukrainian reporter who asks the really good questions at the Pentagon briefings to try and get clarity from people like Pat Ryder. So he says, so far, no clarity from the Department of Defense on whether Ukraine can use Western air defenses to strike targets in Russian airspace. I asked about the reasoning behind such restrictions. Pentagon press secretary said the strategic intent here is enabling Ukraine to defend its sovereign territory. But as I've said, what is defending here? It is shooting stuff inside.
Yesterday we heard from the secretary on his views about striking targets in Russia with American weapons. But can you explain why Ukrainians cannot use those capabilities to strike back and respond to these attacks that come from Russian territory? I mean, we know that the Pentagon does not support that, but what's the reasoning behind this approach?
Well, look, as the secretary highlighted, our policy hasn't changed. We are focused on providing Ukraine with capabilities that it needs to defend itself within Ukrainian sovereign territory. And so, we understand that. We're going to continue to have those conversations with our Ukrainian partners, as well as our international allies and partners, when it comes to the kinds of capabilities to include air defense that Ukraine needs to defend itself. So I'm just going to leave it there.
Notice that, and I showed you this yesterday, but we're going to go on to give a little bit more depth about this because there's been a big debate in a number of different places. But notice he gave no reasoning. He just restated the position.
He also said that aerial dynamic is a little bit different.
To be fair, if I was a reporter there, and of course you want to keep on their side because you want to be invited back, etc., but I'd be pressing that. No, what's the reasoning? You've given me no reasoning. What is the reasoning?
Could you please clarify this commentary? Does this mean that restrictions do not apply to air defense and Ukraine basically can strike targets that are in Russian territory with those air defenses?
Yeah, so, again, as the secretary highlighted, I'm not going to get into picking apart a bunch of different scenarios. Again, the strategic intent here is enabling Ukraine to defend itself and defend its sovereign territory. And so if and when we have anything else to provide on that, we certainly will.
It's just a complete non-answer. So, well, yeah, that's defending itself. It's shooting down that freaking airplane that's dropping the bomb that glides into the territory. We can't shoot the bomb down, so we have to shoot the airplane down. Are you allowing us to do that? Okay. So on and so forth. Right, now, what's happened is so we've had a number of different people. We're going to go on to talk about Antony Blinken in a second, but we'll start here with Michael McCall, who is very much interested in Ukraine being able to do what it can to support themselves, to defend themselves. The US debate is really heating up on the administration's limitations on how Ukraine may defend herself using the weapons given to her. Everyone can see how absurd these restrictions are, says Edward Hunter Christie. McCall has been in Congress talking about Ukraine needing the ability to shoot at Russian targets within Russia. So Noel reports quotes from him here. We'll listen to the whole thing because I think this is super, super important.
Ukraine. We have a really bad situation going on, as you know. This is a sanctuary zone that the Russians have created. And what they're doing is they're lining up all their artillery and rockets and missiles just across the Ukraine border that they then use to attack the Ukrainians. However, your administration and Jake Sullivan have restricted the arms use so that Ukraine cannot defend itself and fire back at Russia. That's why I mandated the ATACMS and the supplemental, the long range, short range, and the HIMARS, that your administration is tying their hands behind their back, not unlike what you're trying to do in Israel. Will you change this policy so Ukraine can fight without one hand tied behind its back?
Well, as you know, we've rallied 50 countries over the last 2 years to come to Ukraine's defense, to provide it with the weapons it needs to defend itself, to push back against Russian aggression. When it comes to enabling, endorsing attacks outside of Ukraine, that's not something we've done, but Ukraine will have to make and will make its own decisions, and I want to make sure it gets the equipment that it needs to effectively
Congress
defend itself.
And again, that is saying exactly what the US has traditionally said, which does leave the door open, but apparently the door isn't open because Zelensky's very explicitly said, hang on, I'm not allowed to use these, otherwise we're not going to get further weapons. So I get what Blinken is trying to do there, just toe the party line, but interestingly, we'll come on to Blinken in a little while. McCall is obviously not happy with that answer.
Got them the equipment, and thank you for implementing that. But Congress did not put restrictions on the use of these weapons. It's Jake Sullivan and your administration that has put the restrictions on these weapons. And I talked to them, and they cannot achieve victory with these restrictions that you, not the Congress, have placed on them. And I hope you'll take that back to the National Security Advisor and the National Security Council and change this policy decision that is very dangerous and damaging to the Ukrainian people.
Absolutely. So I completely agree with McCall, and it's interesting that he lays that really firmly at the feet of the administration there. Now, there is some more nuanced discussion you can have around this with regard to, who is responsible for these decisions. Andrew Perpetua recently had a big old thread where he was absolutely just incensed about the whole situation. But he said, and I'm going to read this to you, and of course, take it with a pinch of salt. He is who he is. Like I myself, I'm no expert in qualifications for being a military analyst, etc., etc. So it is what it is. But he's spoken to some people. This is his take. You have to understand that the United States not allowing Ukraine to use weapons outside of Ukraine is not a limitation imposed just on Ukraine. No, it goes deeper. This is a fundamentally idiotic concept that applies across the entirety of the American military. It is brain rot that comes from the idiots in charge who believe only the president can agree to make cross-border attacks unless the cross-border attack is in self-defense of imminent harm. And somehow the abject idiocy of the United States, who created this rule to cover their own ass in their own expeditionary wars, decided that if it ought to apply to wars of self-defense as well. It is a level of stupid that I don't think people fully grasp. The ban isn't on using American weapons in Russia. It is banning using American weapons in Russia unless in self-defense of some imminent threat. What constitutes an imminent threat is one of those wonderful grey areas nobody's willing to define internationally, intentionally creating paralysis. So I'd agree with this. The kind of grey areas that you arrive at when you use ill-defined terms, like a defensive war. It's the same problem with Elon Musk saying we will only allow Starlink to be used defensively, when the whole war that Ukraine are prosecuting, all of their warlike activities are their whole warfare is defensive. So attacking the Russians in Crimea is a defensive act to keep the Russians, or to get the Russians out of their sovereign territory. And so by saying, no, we're not going to allow the Starlink to be used in Crimea because that's offensive, is just using terms that are really problematic. Like, I would argue, and hopefully successfully, that what Ukraine are doing in Crimea, and in fact in the entirety of this war, even in attacking oil refineries, is defensive. Everything is that they are defending their sovereign territory, and in order to get Russia to stop attacking, like that's to stop you attacking, which is me defending myself, I need to do these things that are under the umbrella of a defensive war that we are prosecuting here. And it's the same thought process here with the American constraints. Perpetua goes on, in order for the United States to change their opinion on this, they would have to admit their policy is idiocy, which is something no American is ever willing to admit, no matter the evidence stacked against them, because America is the best country on earth. And this isn't a Biden thing, it's an American thing. The short of it, though, is that people are just not recognizing just how stupid the decision is. People are so hyped about the issue being about attacking Russia. It's not. It's much more stupid than that. This comes from the same military that believes blowing up a small bridge should be an order only a general can approve. So if you're a little platoon defending a town with one road and it gets attacked, you can't blow up the bridge unless your general agrees. It's that type of stupid. The United States are so warped in the head, he says this as an American, about collateral damage that they cannot make rational decisions or have any sort of logically coherent positions or issues, or even apply the most basic aspects of nuance. Like the US firing random missiles into Pakistan while fighting in Afghanistan might be just a smidge different than Ukraine firing missiles into Russia after Russia launched a full-scale invasion into Ukraine. But to America, these are the same thing somehow, and indiscriminately bombing an inner city is somehow the same thing as blowing up a small bridge, because like civilian infrastructure or something. So he was just having just a big purge of his frustration there. And I spoke to him last night. We were direct messaging about this, and he was like, the US are not going to change their mind on this. That said, apparently Blinken, so on the back of that appearance in Congress, Secretary of State Blinken is pushing President Biden to relax restrictions on the employment of US-provided weapons inside Russia. This is what John Ridge is saying in reaction to a New York Times article. This is the first indication that the administration may revise this policy, which has been in place since February 2022. Well, arguably, someone like Andrew would say, actually, it's been in place a lot longer than that. This is just, you can't use our weapons too far across borders, unless it's defensively in an imminent threat. And, we can talk about the difficulty of assigning clarity to that phraseology. Colby Badward says, exclusive from the New York Times, after a sobering trip to Kyiv, Secretary of State Antony Blinken is urging the president to lift restrictions on how Ukraine can use American arms, even though his tone and party line there behind the scenes. Blinken has long been Ukraine's number one advocate in the administration. Can he convince the ever cautious president? And quote here from the New York Times: since the first American shipments of sophisticated weapons to Ukraine, President Biden has never wavered on one prohibition. Zelensky has to agree to never fire them into Russian territory, insisting that would violate Mr. Biden's mandate to, quote, avoid World War III. But the consensus around the policy is fraying. Propelled by his State Department, there is now a vigorous debate inside the administration over relaxing the ban to allow the Ukrainians to hit missiles missile and artillery launch sites just over the border in Russia, targets that Mr. Zelensky says have enabled Moscow's recent territorial gains. The proposal, pressed by Secretary of State Antony Blinken after a sobering visit to Kiev last week, is still in its formative stages, and it's not clear how many of his colleagues among Mr. Biden's inner circle have signed on. It's not yet been formally presented to the president, who has traditionally been the most cautious, officials said. So there are these two schools of thought. One is this is just the American way of doing things, like military strategy, and there's one that is this is the Biden administration strategy based on the thought processes of Jake Sullivan, for example, and Biden himself, perhaps. So I don't know. Sometimes I think, yeah, this is Biden and particularly Sullivan. And then other times I think that there must be something more ingrained within the military doctrine here from the Department of Defense that is also informing this. It can't just be like Jake Sullivan going, yeah, no, I don't want them firing here, and there. Like, this must be something that's maybe tangled up with nuclear de-escalation or nuclear anti-escalation military doctrine and military strategizing that's been in place, through the Cold War years. I don't know. No report says there's an ongoing debate within the Biden administration about this. Talks about the New York Times article, and then post this, and this made me angry. And other people have pointed this out. So the picture on the front of it, or in this, attached to this New York Times article, which is, okay, inside the White House is the title, a debate over letting Ukraine shoot US weapons into Russia. After a sobering trip to Kiev, the Secretary Blinken, blah, blah, blah. And then it has this picture. And then the caption to the picture is the aftermath of a Ukrainian attack on Belgorod, Russia, earlier this month. So it's tying the idea that if we allow, or if the US allows US weapons to be used inside Russia, this kind of thing will happen. And of course, the open source intelligence analyses of this building situation was that it wasn't a Ukrainian attack. In fact, the Russians have been really quiet on this. Interestingly, they haven't gone on about how this possibly, because they've done this, they're doing it literally right now in Kharkiv. But the open source intelligence indicates that there was no missile, certainly from the front of the building, that the explosion came out from the bottom of the building, looked like an internal explosive device at the bottom of the building, or some kind of explosion, a gas explosion maybe from the bottom that caused everything to fall down. And then even looking at the back of the building is not apparent that there was any missile going to the back, etc., etc. So the New York Times here is just taking on a Russian talking point, or the initial claims that came from the Russians and pro-Russian sources that this was a Ukrainian attack, but it wasn't a Ukrainian attack. I would bet good money on that not being a Ukrainian attack, and yet it kind of colours the debate as to whether the US should give weapons to Russia because they might do things like this, or should give weapons to Ukraine because they might do things like this. They might strike these civilian targets within Russia, and it's just really frustrating. So I tweeted New York Times for what it's worth, and I'd ask you to do so as well, just to show your ire about the use of that image. Moving on, Jake Sullivan within this is not quite to do with what we've just been talking about, but to do with what Grant Shapps says, the UK Secretary of Defence, who yesterday claimed that, or was it 2 days ago now, claimed that the Chinese were giving lethal aid to Russia, and I was saying this is huge news. Well, Shashank Joshi says Jake Sullivan within hours contradicts Grant Shapps' claim that this morning that China has sent or will soon send lethal aid to Russia. Quote, "We have not seen that to date. I look forward to speaking with the UK to make sure we have a common operating picture." In other words, if you got intelligence and we don't, I would wait before leaping to conclusions, says Shashank Joshi. A defence source tells me a UK intelligence does indeed have evidence of Chinese lethal aid, that parts of the US system, presumably DIA or others in IC, have seen it, and that the evidence is being shared with allies more broadly. Don't have any details, but China has steadily escalated dual-use support to the point where it's vital to Russia's defence industry and war economy, and if it were crossing the line to lethal aid, it makes sense that it would seek to do so at first in limited and deniable ways. interesting stuff from Shashant Joshi there to indicate that actually Jake Sullivan has it wrong. Politico reports that Zelensky is to visit France, Italy, both those countries, to urge NATO to down Russian missiles over Ukraine. So not just about firing missiles into Russia, but using NATO or allied weapons to help down threats that are over Ukrainian airspace. President Zelensky is planning to visit the D-Day commemoration in France and a G7 meeting in Italy in June to ask partners for more military aid. Now, Poland is apparently considering the technical and legal aspects of using its air defense systems to shoot down Russian missiles near its borders, but no decisions have yet been made. This would be really good for Ukraine. Ukraine have said that, hey, we'll sign a paperwork to say that you won't be legally responsible if there are any air defense missiles that go awry or shoot down a drone or Russian missile that then lands on civilian infrastructure, etc., etc. So, Ukraine are really up for that happening. Now, moving on to actual aid here and whatnot, it will take as long as 2 years for Sweden to reach the desired capacity to provide Ukraine with more ammunition and strengthen the Swedish armed forces, Swedish Defence Minister Paul Jonsson said in an interview with Bloomberg. Now, remember, they have just given a whopping $7 billion over 3 years to Ukraine to allow their own armed forces as well. Alongside that, they are making procurements with BAE systems for example, the CV9040 or the upgraded version of that, and one presumes for artillery ammunition and whatnot. But it will take time to get up to speed. Quote, Russia's gotten back to its feet faster than the Euro-Atlantic community. I expect we will catch up, but I think it will take a year or two before we see the full effect. Now, just to remind you on really quite how much aid Sweden have given, that's $7 billion over 3 years, which is something like $2.3 billion a year. Sweden is a country of 10 million people. If you multiplied that by 33, assuming, US, it might even be more than 330 million now, then you would get a $230 billion aid package over 3 years. And that appears to be more than what the US has given. So when you still get these claims that, the US, Europe need to pay more, they need to pick it up, they need to match us, like Trump keeps saying. It's like, well, Sweden alone have given more incomparable terms per capita than the US has given. So, yeah, absolutely incredible. If the US wants to match the size of the package, it would need a $230 billion package, since there are 33 times as many US inhabitants. So, yeah, pretty incredible there from Sweden. Baltic countries are pushing for a 2.5% of GDP defense spending during the NATO summit that's due to take place. The defense ministers of Lithuania, Latvia and Estonia met in the Lithuanian town of Palanga on the 22nd to agree on their key goals ahead of the upcoming NATO summit, including an allied commitment to invest at a level of 2.5%, not just 2%. And of course, those Baltic nations already do stuff outside of that's spending on Ukraine to support Ukraine in terms of humanitarian aid, financial assistance, etc., etc. So you could argue that all of that funding, all of that money that they're spending, that they're budgeting on Ukraine, is in a sense part of their military spending. It's part of the warfare that's going on. And it depends how you slice and dice these statistics. I've said that many times before. But those countries that are closest to Ukraine geographically, Poland and Germany being great examples, have a much greater burden on things like their welfare system, with the influx of refugees and the impact on the education and healthcare and so on and so forth. So that's all paying to support Ukraine in the war, which is just as important as paying for missiles for Ukraine, etc., etc. And so, should you include that all together in working out what different countries are doing? I think so. Latvia allocates nearly $6.5 million to Ukraine's infrastructure development. They pledged that to, I presume it's to do with trains. That's the image from the Kyiv Independent there. Obviously, everything helps there, and Latvia contributing towards Ukraine in many different ways. Ukrainians themselves have purchased $25 billion worth of domestic government bonds since the start of the full-scale war. So this is a way of raising money for the country, where you take out a bond, which is essentially like a sort of loan, and the government pay you back with interest, and it's a way that they can generate money from sources other than other governments, although you can get bonds through, other governments, I presume, can pick them up and whatnot. So, interesting way of fundraising. There's been a lot of talk about Europeans doing this as well to help Ukraine raise funds. Russian Su-30SM fighter jet has been spotted with R-37M long-range air-to-air missiles for the first time. The long-range air-to-air missile is designed to engage targets at distances exceeding 300 kilometers. Why this is important to note is, one, this is the first time. So what's going on there? Are they expecting F-16s to be in the air pretty soon? So they are starting to kit themselves with these. But also it shows that the Ukrainians will be at a disadvantage, I think, still, even with the F-16s, in terms of air-to-air ranged munitions on board the Russian fighters, or on board the Russian jets. They seriously outrange the Ukrainian jets at the moment, the old Soviet jets. Even if they've got comparable jets, the Russians have better radars and weapons on their jets than the Ukrainians do. And that conveys an advantage that is significant. And it means that if you're talking about shooting at planes beyond the visual horizon, then the Russians have the ability to do that where the Ukrainians don't. And even with the F-16s, it depends what munitions they have, but the F-16s are not necessarily going to give an advantage to the Ukrainians. The Russians will still arguably have an aerial advantage there. It depends what munitions the Ukrainians will be given and how they get to use those F-16s. And then just finally here, this is the chieftain he's a former tanker. I've watched videos with him back at the beginning of the war, just getting information on different tanks. He works for wargaming.net, who are the makers of World of Tanks, and he consults on tanks and the specifications and how they're used and how they would operate in the computer game. And he said, my civilian employer, which has a large office in Kyiv, so Wargaming.net used to be a Russian company, and it divested, or it basically, at the start of the war, it became not a Russian company. Obviously realized that would be counterproductive. But I presume that he's talking about Wargaming.net here, has been running campaigns to aid Ukraine. $1 million combined corporative and customer donations isn't bad going. A baker's dozen ambulances will make the difference for more than a few lives over the coming years. It's interesting. I play World of Tanks now and then. I haven't played for ages just because time. But occasionally you see, because you can put flags on top of your tanks, you see the odd Russian flag and you think, you're on my side. I just want to blow you up. Anyway. There you go. 13 ambulances purchased with donations from Wargaming.net fans are now saving lives. Last October, the World of Tanks creator launched a project to support Ukrainian medical workers. Players from 115 countries joined in, helping to raise over $1 million for Reanimobiles. I don't know what that is. Type C ambulances, that's what they are, with the best equipment, have already gone to Vinnytsia, Lviv, Kyiv, Odessa, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, Zaporizhia, Sumy, and Kherson oblasts. So that's pretty incredible stuff there. United 24 involved in that, enabling Wargaming to get that done. So brilliant stuff. Great. And as I always say, what's the equivalent for Russia? Have Russia done anything like this? Is anyone raising money in the same way for Russia out of the goodness of their hearts? Less so. Now, talking about raising money, just to remind people, I am going to be giving a talk in June the 15th in North Hampshire in the Andover area. So if you live around there and want to come and see me bang on about stuff, as I always do, please support the fundraising they're doing for drones, or you can just support the fundraising they're doing for drones without coming to the talk. There's an email in the description below. There's also a link to help out with the drone fundraising. So if you can help out with that, that'd be absolutely fabulous. And it'd be great to see some of you if you do manage to make it. The email will go to someone who will hopefully vet to make sure that you aren't FSB. So anyway, that's that. In the meantime, take care. Speak to you soon.